Welcome to the TNT Podcast, a show about tabletop games where we take a rulebook and give it the book club treatment. With me here is my co-host Troy and our producer Jay. And today's topic is TSR's Boot Hill, first edition.
So today we are doing an overview of the origins, the systems and mechanics, as well as the impact and influence of Boot Hill. This is a classic of the Western genre and also a pioneer of man-to-man skirmish gaming. And there is a lot to cover here, so we're going to dive right in with the origins now.
Thanks, Troy. Boot Hill was first published by TSR in 1975, 1 year following Dungeons & Dragons. Though, from what I can tell, it's very likely that they were working on it either in parallel or prior to that time. It's often referred to as the second role-playing game, but from some of my reading into the game itself, and Troy certainly has a similar takeaway, that may be a bit of a misnomer, but I wouldn't say it's entirely untrue either. What I learned in researching the origins of this game weren't so much around the game itself, but around the phenomena of role-playing games as, dare I say, an emergent thing rather than, say, a single point sort of invention. And that mainly pertains around me learning about a game through research called Western Gunfight, which emerges from, I believe, Bristol in the UK, 1970. And this was a game club that I think I've mentioned in previous episodes that there is a sort of war game, board game community. And a subsect of that are war game miniatures. And we mentioned during the D&D and Chainmail podcasts that there were fantasy elements, but also this also creates another one of those sort of niches within a niche, which is the man-to-man game, the combat game. I'm familiar with this as being referred to as a skirmish game, sometimes in its full title as a man-to-man skirmish game, where you are handling a scale of characters or a number of characters at a scale where you might only be using 5 units against 5 units. So you have, I guess in the Western term, you have a posse or a gang trying to achieve a goal like rob a bank or a train or something similar, and another gang that's trying to interfere with them. And the total number of units on the table, probably maximum 10 to 12.
100%.
But even that would be considered large scale.
Well, what's interesting about a man-to-man skirmish game is it allows you to get a much more intimate and characterful experience out of a traditional war game. Whereas you describe 6 to 12 figures aside, that would be sometimes just a unit by itself in a larger mass battle game. So here you can already see with the skirmish titles, such as Boot Hill, you're getting a much more narrow perspective on the combatants, their immediate circumstance, and how the battle progresses for each individual person. And when we look at a game like Boot Hill, I think that's what makes it so intriguing, as it does straddle the line between role-playing game and skirmish war game.
Just to tie back to this older game, so this older game is Western Gunfight. It's a skirmish-style game that is similar to Boot Hill,
right?
But evidently made 5 years before that in a completely different country. And the battle reports of this, spread through newsletters and zines, were known to Gary Gygax. So there's a connection there. But a lot of what is read in those battle reports is a game that has a lot of personal character, where there are sort of named heroes that are achieving things over the course of the campaign. And like we were mentioning in the Brownsteins that precursed Dungeons and Dragons, this game seems to do the same thing, that may have influenced not only a game like Boot Hill, which may have already been in development because of this, but actually may have influenced Dungeons & Dragons as well, in the same way that the Brownsteins had. So that's the end of the history. But yeah, Troy, you already sort of got into an element of the system, so we can kind of continue along those lines.
Absolutely. With a game like Boot Hill, there is a detailed tactical game system. This is going to be based on the bespoke ability scores that each individual character has. So you're going to have a bunch of difference between the types of characters that you field. There will be some that'll be more brawl oriented. We'll get to that later, but that's going to represent your close combat, your fisticuffs. There will be some characters that'll be natural shooters, and there will be a bit of diversity across your posse, as we called it earlier. In this game, speed is one of the primary attributes, and the initiative system, the way that it sequences your actions between the characters in the gunfight, that is the meat of the game. That's where things get most interesting, and that's where this title is different than its contemporary peers. It has a really interesting take on activation for your Wild West participants.
One of the reasons that I noted that this being a role-playing game is something slightly, maybe a bit misconceptive, is even seen in the actual characteristics for each character. So what we would call ability scores in Dungeons and Dragons. And those scores are very much tied to the act of gunfighting, and not so much around a more broad sense. So I'll just read off the four main ones, which are speed.
Yeah.
Very important in this game.
Absolutely.
As we will learn it going forward. Gun accuracy, also important. It also includes anything thrown. So it's, in terms of a game like Warhammer, we would consider this to be your range weapon skill. So it's baked into the attributes of the character as opposed to some secondary element. And then after that, we have strength and bravery, which again is we can consider that a mental condition skill, but it's specifically tailored to fighting. I mean, I assume you could apply bravery to other things, but there's an implication that all of these base character abilities are really focused thematically around just a gunfight. So this sort of implies the idea of it being a combat game before it actually suggests the idea of being a role-playing game.
It does have an improving of character abilities. There are some aspects that you will see as a war game, but I'm going to really say that, first and foremost, it's a skirmish game more than it is anything else in my personal understanding and take on these rules.
So I guess going into that, we may as well treat it as a war game of sorts, or a tabletop battle game. And if we're approaching it from that point, we may as well talk about the turn sequence, because that's another aspect that leans more in that direction. It has an explicit sequence of actions that happen within a round of combat. So Troy, maybe you can kind of get us started on that.
100%. So the turn sequence is where that initiative order really comes into play. And as you do with almost every check in this game, you're rolling percentile dice. And what you're doing is you're rolling percentile dice, and your forces, your individual members of the posse, your gang, are moving in the indicated order. Low numbers move first, higher numbers moving last. And that's the first twist of the game. That's the first bit of the trouble, I guess we'll call it, because you're already losing your activation reliability. You're not losing it, but you're already having to ride the roller coaster of your dice results. And I think that right there is a hallmark of a very interesting tactical experience where you're served up a plate of decisions and you have to navigate them, as opposed to having this omnipotent control over your force, right? So that would be how the movement determination works at the start of the game turn. Then you move into the firing resolution. So players are first going to state which characters are firing, indicate who they're firing at, and how they're firing, how many shots, basically. Firing order is then determined, and that is going to be one of the most interesting and detailed parts of the game, because how the firing order is determined is that's first shot determination, and There's a lot of modifiers that go into that, but it is probably the part of the game that is the most unique. As in that moment, Max, I'm sure you'll give me some insight on this in a moment, but that's when the characters draw, and that's where you see who actually wins the duel. And this can be modified by a whole variety of factors, but I think that is what makes this sizzle as a Wild West game.
Yeah, so as you were mentioning, we determine movement, and then we determine, which is determined by a random percentile roll, lowest number to highest, which mirrors on to, if people aren't familiar with percentile games, you take 2d10s that are demarked by either their numerators or color, or any other way of marking it. You roll them, and then they spell out between them the first and second digit of the percentage.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that.
And this is usually handled as a roll under system. So you have a value, and then you're trying to roll under it. And as that value improves, you increase the range of success. And there's a lot of interesting reasons for why this is both using a high number generator like a 100 die, or a percentile, which is effectively rolling between 0 and 100, or 1 and 100, sorry, and a roll under system, which the argument is it contains the results. So nothing can be over 100. That's not expressly true. We can talk about other systems that are D100 that go above 100%, but that the baseline is sort of contained within the dice roll.
Exactly.
So once the firing resolution, so effectively every character has a speed, which is based on their speed stat, and also based on the weapon they're using, and any other modifiers like whether they are injured or in a difficult situation. But those are sort of extra elements that are sort of put onto that. The next element, once that's determined, is then any characters that are hit. So we go through the order and we go, the person with the highest speed shoots first. And we go down in that order. If anyone is injured when it comes around, say before their turn activates, when their turn activates, they now have to include any of the injury modifiers from being shot. So, as I was jokingly saying with Troy before we started, and we were discussing the rules, he who hits first hits best.
Absolutely.
The game is very much hinged on that. Unlike other, say, like Dungeons and Dragons, where you're rolling things like damage and there's hit points, that doesn't actually factor in. There's only 3 kinds of damage that could actually be inflicted on someone, and it's hit locational. So you can receive a light wound, a serious wound, or a mortal wound. And then depending on where on the body you receive those wounds, that will affect, at least in the case of minor and serious, that will affect the penalty that you might incur. So if you're shot in the leg, you now walk slower.
Yeah.
If you're shot in the arm, you draw slower. But there's very little consideration to, say, a numerical interpretation of damage, because they are treating a bullet as a bullet. It's just about how quickly it gets to you.
The way that they handle, I guess, armor or the absence of armor and cover is really interesting, because when you are taking a position and you're shooting around the corner of a building, say you're on the edge of the saloon, it's going to show your head, your shoulder, your arm, and your leg on the exposed side as you step out to take your shot. So if the opponent takes a shot at you and rolls a hit, when they roll their to hit location, if you are struck where you're covered by the building, it converts the hit back to a miss. And that's just an interesting wrinkle in how it handles the gunfighting, but it is a very lethal system. And as Max said, a bullet's a bullet. And if it catches you, you're going to take a serious penalty, or you're just outright going to die from it.
One caveat to how those injuries are dispersed is that some body parts, so the body parts that are listed, the hit locations, are head, chest, abdomen, each leg, each arm, and each shoulder. Not all of these are denoted as actually being capable of a lethal wound, which in essence means you die. But head, chest, abdomen, yes. Shoulders, yes. Arms and legs, not so much. I think arms are completely exempt, and I think legs are too. Though, if you think about it realistically, there's some pretty serious arteries that go through the legs. But for the sake of, I think some of it is for the sake of balance, that some limbs are more vulnerable than others, and the most you could receive by getting shot in the arm is a useless arm.
Right.
So one thought or criticism that I have along those lines, or at least something that popped up into my mind, is how to differentiate between weapons. Because, well, wouldn't you just want the fastest weapon? And they have an interesting way of, I suppose, resolving that. So I guess we can talk about equipment. So you've got all the Wild West classics. You've got cap and ball revolvers, single action, double action revolvers, scatterguns, shotguns. Not always determined between the difference of those. But then you have Civil War rifles, Civil War carbines. They even have buffalo rifles, which, if anyone's familiar with that, are very, very big. As well as some other elements or other weapons, such as knives, bows, and even very small guns like a Derringer. And as we stated, the key element in these is the speed, certainly within a small space like, the town square or wherever the showdown is happening. But some of the other offputs, or sort of the balancing elements, are the reload rate and the rate of fire, as well as 4 distinctive range bands.
So what is unique about this is the balance between these factors, right? You've got your unique ranges at these different range bands, and you're going to incur penalties as you go up the range bands. So different weapons will be within in either spaces or inches, depending if you're playing grid or measured. But there'll be different, effectively, brackets. So let's take a look at the double action revolver. You're at short range between 0 to 4 inches, medium range from 4 to 10, long 10 to 20, and extreme goes all the way up from 20 to 40 inches. So that's different than the other revolvers. That's different than the rifles. So it's a very context-heavy game for when is a weapon appropriate versus another. It's not going to roll a different damage die, for example, or have a different damage statistic, but it will interact with the tactical situation in a different way. And I think that's what helps to make the choice different, rather than always going with what is perceived as maybe optimal in one category. Because there's going to be scenarios where you're up in the church tower and maybe you do want that Civil War rifle that otherwise has some range issues that you have to get around with, if you're trying to use that up close. So just different things to think about. But the game is really interesting in that you have to have observation and sighting accounted for. So there's sort of a movement maneuver focus to the gunfights as well. You don't just stand in the middle of the street, and you don't just get an easy cover save for being adjacent some tumbleweed in a crate, like there's actually like a sighting system and mechanic that's accounted for. And for how target selection works is you may shoot at any target that you're aware of. So if someone has managed to get behind a building on you, you've lost awareness of them. They're obviously out of line of sight. They're no longer a valid target. But also people getting behind your character and getting out of the line of sight that's described in the game, which is a 90 degree cone to your front. So it has an interesting interplay there. And then we get into the first shot determination. We mentioned this a little bit, but these are the modifiers that are going to help determine the order that you go when you make your attack with that weapon you've selected. Things like surprise, movement, the wounds, if you're shooting from the hip. These will all modify and change your placement in the first shot determination. And I think that is, that's kind of where the game slows down. This first shot determination sequence is a little cumbersome when you look at it as someone who hasn't played this game, with the miniatures on the table. I see that this would be the big stumbling point for a new player or even an existing player, because you're always going to have to be referencing this, because there's enough modifiers that you won't just simply keep them in your mind as easily as you might.
It's one of those games where you're going to be referring to tables and lists a lot.
Yeah.
So first shot determination chart, listed here, you are accounting for, and these are just subcategories within the chart.
Yeah.
Surprise, movement, wounds, and then they have miscellaneous. And so under those, there are different, and in this case, there aren't too many to have to factor, but you can see yourself kind of like going down the list. And as you would become more familiar with the game, I'm sure some of these would become more secondhand to mind. But, under surprise, character, opponent, the first move. So if one character moves before the other, that can be a -1. Which on a percentile system isn't that big of a detail. And then under movement, are they running in a defensive manner? So are they running and dodging, or are they on horseback?
Yes.
That can make a huge difference. So these are sort of the first shot determinations. And then there's an entire list of hit determinations.
Right. That's the next list. This is where I guess the modifiers get heavier.
Absolutely, yeah. So they include things like range, shooter movement, or movement of shooter, movement of target. So there's a relative sense of the distance between the shooter and the target and what each of them are doing. There's another factoring on wounds, which was present on the first shot determination, and then a whole handful of miscellaneous ones, including things like second shot this turn, third shot this turn, scatter gun fire. Strangely enough, shotgun fire is... I'm always curious about when scattergun is mentioned and like, what is that specifically referring to? Though I do think that there is a historical reference for that.
I love shooting with the wrong hand. That's my favorite.
Yeah, so there's an element of handedness, which I know is present in a lot of Western games, I should say. Light wounds, serious wounds, firing 2 pistols at once, hip shots, and so on. And
then lastly, there's a bit of a cover reference there, as you will incur a penalty if someone is obscured, if 50% or less of the target is visible. So that's another way in which cover kind of factors in. So that's something else we should mention, is it does determine the hit in general.
Yeah.
But that would be some of what makes shooting the most interesting part of the game, through first shot and through the hit determination chart. But it definitely is the part of the game where you're going to be referencing the tables. You're going to be slowing down a little bit. But I also think some of the interplay in there might make all that worth it.
And so once a shot is made, then wounds are determined, which, as we said, are hit locational. So there's a random determination of hit location that is also cross-referenced with the severity of the wound. So, so they have all of the previously mentioned hit locations that are dialed into a percentile. And then there's a separate percentile based on the damage. So, and as I mentioned before, some limbs don't count as mortal. Yeah, so I was correct in saying that both legs and both arms do not result in mortal wounds, but everywhere else, if you roll, with the exception of head, between 60 and 00, that's a kill.
Yeah.
And on the head, it goes as low as 40.
He just done did them. Yeah.
Yeah, they're done. And that's always the surprising thing about any experience that I've had with Boot Hill, though I'm more familiar in playing 3rd edition, that it is a shockingly lethal game.
Yeah, you really get that when you read it. Like, you really can see that it's a game where your tactical decisions will have big consequences. And that, again, helps make it feel like a skirmish game.
It does.
Because, imagine taking your multi-hour campaign character into a Boot Hill fight. It's hard not to imagine just hiding behind a crate with them. You know what I mean? Just trying to keep them alive.
Survival is an interesting proposition in this game, because you obviously want to get the most use out of your characters, but they could be ended very, very quickly, and that may not matter at all.
Well, and the next thing that happens in the turn sequence is another way that you can end a character, and that would be when you get into close combat, into melee. And it's called brawling. And after the firing portion is done, so after everyone has shot all their guns, like first everyone moves, like we talked about, then you shoot all your guns in all the ways in which you do that, then punching. When you get into this, you can use like a knife. You can use a tomahawk, for example. So there's different weapons, but you can also just throw fists or grapple. There's kind of a mix for different types of punches and what their effect can be. It's the punching table. So there's actually a degree of focus and, I guess, depth to this brawling system that makes it kind of, how I keep saying this feels like a skirmish game to me. But then the depth that you get out of this brawling system wraps back around to something where controlling more than a handful of characters would be a fair bit of work.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about the brawl system is that it differs in a lot of ways from the shooting.
Yes, that's very true.
I'm not sure how to describe this exactly, but the shooting is sort of like this very orderly sequence of, okay, everyone moves, I pick a target, I determine the modifiers, and then see if I hit them, and then there's a subsequent round of everyone doing that. The brawling feels like a real dust-up.
Yeah, it does.
Because essentially what you do is once you're in range and you declare that you're engaged in fisticuffs with another combatant, you then just roll on a random table where 50% of the results are misses and some of the results are different kinds of hits. So to give you an example, I also suspect this is rolled on am I wrong in thinking that looks like it's rolled on a D20?
I think it's a 2D10 counted, you know what I mean?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So there's another, when doing certain executions, I should mention this because this is an interesting thing. Rather than counting the two tens as the first and second digit, in some cases, like the brawling chart, the results are added together.
Yes.
And so this is how you create that sort of peaked average, which would be, I guess, around 10 and 11. Or 10 and... Yeah, probably around that. Oh, wait. The average would be the total number minus 1? Okay. Never mind. I think I got the math wrong on that. Yeah, so on this, you have 2 or less all the way up to 8 to 9. Or sorry, 5 to 7, I should say. So 2 to 7 is a flat out miss.
Just nothing.
On some of those misses, there's actually a modifier that gives your opponent an advantage. So if you roll like a 2, it's a +2 against you. Then an 8 and a 9 is a block. And then and then upward, now we're starting to actually hit. So we have a glancing blow. So, you just kind of breeze them. Jab, a hook, a combination, which, let's see. There's a particular way of executing on that. You've got a rabbit punch, which is a term I'm not actually familiar with. And then you have an uppercut, and of course the haymaker is 19 or more. And the effect of this is the type of punch and the damage are kind of all rolled together. And you're basically just like, I want to sort of give it the context that there's sort of this, the rules suggest something that feels, and this isn't a criticism exactly, but it feels like a sort of Looney Tunes cloud of smoke with fists flying around in it.
I totally see that.
And then we go down to grapples. It's kind of similar, except it's more or less an immediate this result. And some of the results under the halfway point, which is about 9 to 10.
Yeah.
The lower of those are either no effect with a penalty, or you absolutely biff it and now you are an extreme decision. You basically hit yourself by trying to launch yourself at the other person. And then upward of that are arm locks, elbow smashes, full on throwing a guy. But this is the thing, is melee combat is almost randomly predetermined to whatever the situation you roll on the dice is. Like the highest one on the grapple is a bear hug, which I suppose, being a bear hug, you pin their arms and probably knock them to the ground.
The only way you can get out of a bear hug is to grapple check. So you can't, for example, if someone arm locks you, it'll prevent you from being able to strike with whatever limb is locked. But with a bear hug, you're shut down. You have to be able to grapple your way out of it. And in some matchups, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. And then that's essentially the basics of the rule. Like, most of the rules in this cover just some kind of gunfight. There are rules later on, and this is where I think the role-playing element enters when there's consideration for campaign play.
Right. I mean, before the campaign, there's a section on advanced rules where you can do old school simultaneous movement turns. There's firing during movement that's covered.
Yeah.
And there's even an alternative for shot determination sequence. So that is available if you want to modify your base game.
Mm-hmm.
But really, what makes this really hum is the possibility space implied by the thin but very intriguing campaign game suggestions.
Yes. So there's, after the initial set of rules and advanced and optional rules, we finally enter into the campaign. So the way they describe campaigns, this feels very reminiscent of Dungeons and Dragons. So I do feel that if the games were being simultaneously made, this is where the D&D-isms begin to fold over into this game. So it's interesting to look at Boot Hill as a kind of mirror or lens to what D&D is going through just before it, or sort of subsequently around it. And so the game requires a referee, which in some of the optional rules is mentioned. So for instance, they mention that there are hidden movements or stealth movements, and that requires a referee for what I think is obvious reasons. But in this case, it mentions that the referee will play non-player characters, essentially. So either opponents or civilians, possibly allies under maybe certain circumstances. But it is amending the idea that this is a game where you're playing as a gang. It does break down the idea that there is it focuses more around player characters, and that there are some subordinate minion characters that might be shared between them.
The campaign system really strikes a chord because it has maps, it has tracking a campaign calendar, and there are moves that you make on this greater campaign map, and it talks about moving on foot, moving on horse. There is strategic mounted movement accounted for you're traversing the landscape, and then you can zoom it on in and do a game of Boot Hill. So it has this dynamic scaling to the campaign. It doesn't really give you a lot of resources to interpret how to go about all that, in its classic early role-playing origins here. But it is really interesting. And I think out of everything that I take away from Boot Hill, I like the cool initiative, even if it's, overburdened. I like the style of the game in many respects, but it's what the campaign system promises you could do that really gets me.
Yeah, no, it's it promises a lot that I wouldn't say it doesn't deliver, but it really does. Its promise gets the imagination going. For instance, they have rules for tracking people. And I think a lot of it comes from like them thinking about the fiction, whether it being novels or movies that typify the Western genre. So you have a determination of posses. So there's a determination for how many people would be in a group under command. There's tracking and different conditions by which that's easier or harder. They even have things for aging and like the change of time. So for instance, speed and accuracy go down as the character gets older. So does strength. I think bravery is the only one that doesn't change. I don't know what the argument to, maybe bravery, maybe are older men braver, or
that's an interesting question.
I think they're right. They're probably right in their determination.
No,
it varies too much between individuals. We may as well say it does nothing. There is long-term healing, so there's a consideration for what happens after the battle. And there's even an entire short list of cost of living. So, they have the prices of everything from hats to coffee, whiskey, tobacco, and a whole different range of lodgings.
Including an undertaker cost per burial.
Yes.
I mean, we talked about how lethal this game is. It knows it.
Yeah. It's definitely aware of what you're going to be doing in the game, and it supports that.
Burying your characters.
And then after that, we're just looking at different charts. There's some interesting ones here where they have a list of, I guess you could consider them pre-spec'd characters. So we have famous people from history like...
Billy the Kid. Yeah, don't forget.
Yeah, Billy the Kid is in there. I think we have...
I don't know who Ike Clanton is, but there's a whole bunch of Clantons in here.
Yeah, they've got every Clanton imaginable.
Even the old man himself made it.
Yeah. Basically, they have a bunch of famous gunfighters. I think some of them may be fictional, but a lot of them look historic. Jesse James.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
I'm sure they have Doc Holliday, and they have a whole bunch I've never heard of, but clearly they looked into it. And these lists just go. Like, what is this? At least 4 to 5 pages dedicated to just pre-spec'd characters. So the nice thing about that is that if you want to just play a scenario by grabbing a bunch of random gunfighters and you want to know how Wyatt Earp fared against Billy the Kid, then you can do that kind of speculation if you like. Of course, it's determined on what they thought that was the statting on these characters.
Yeah, it's kind of like you could do like an exhibition match if it were a sporting game.
Yeah,
as
exactly.
It were. There's a lot of potential in this book. Would I have come to the same mechanical conclusions that they did to resolve some of the actions? I don't know. But at the same time, man, did this make me want to play a Western game? Yes. And did it make me want to be a player in a campaign? Absolutely it did. Did it make me want to even run a campaign? Sure.
It was very inspiring. It got my wheels turning quite a bit. And I realized, maybe this is something we can talk at the end, but I realized that a lot of the American origins of fantasy things, fantasy works, are essentially Westerns in one form or another. There are exceptions to that, but there's a Western, the root of Westerns in American culture, and we're Canadian, but we still factor into this. Even South American, because they have their own version of cowboys, gauchos. That it's that new world, it's that frontier, it's that element. Having a game that goes back to essentially the essence of that thing and being like, oh yeah, this is like, there's just something really evocative about this. So just to end off, the last appendice is 2 scenarios, one historic, one fictional. So the training game, so effectively the example that you can play through is the gunfight at the OK Corral, which is a very famous gunfight. And an interesting one, if you go and look it up. I think it's probably notable because it's so documented. The second scenario is a fictional one called the Battle of Coffeeville. And this is a scenario that is more of a fictionalized cinematic gunfight. So it's the Dalton Gang, of course, classic name for that. And they've got all of these fictional characters: Grant Dalton, Billy Powers, Dick Broadwell, your standard stuff. And it's basically a more expansive street fight where 2 gangs attack each other, one of them from 2 outside points and then the other 2 within the middle. And it's got specifications for, like, all the buildings are locked and so they can't be entered. And there are various factors. And it's a sort of standalone that could be included into a campaign. But then that is then followed by the Appendix D campaign scenario, which is called Promise City. And anyone familiar with later editions of Boot Hill will know that this is effectively the campaign setting hub. So Promise City is a fictional town in a region which is used as a hex crawl in later editions. But yeah, this is where it gets set up. It says somewhere in the Southwest. That's as much you need to know about the eponymous location of Promise City. And yeah, and then after that, we have a fictional character chart, which is essentially a lot of the characters that are presented in the city, but these are mainly gunfighters, or they could be enemies. They can be used in a range of different ways. And then there's a scenario that uses the city and its surrounding regions. And then it goes into a lot of detail about, I guess this is, as I say, though it's a historical game, a fictionalized historical game, this is what we would now call the campaign setting. And it ranges from lists of establishments and non-player characters. It's a fun list of characters with sufficiently evocative names.
Yes.
All the way down to building interiors and breakdowns of sort of floor plans in case you want to have a shootout. Most of this, the main one being the saloon, of course. And then after that, we've just got the short lists. So all of your charts separate from the rules, so you don't have to look things up. And that is the Book of Boot Hill, first edition. I found it imposing in all of its rule structures, but then by the end of it, I realized it's actually kind of a short game.
It's true.
Like, as far as the book is concerned.
I think what it manages to achieve with like just the mere ideas it presents is more than enough for any of the mechanical gripes I may have with it. But in terms of it being a cowboy game, it hits so much of what you want because it focuses in on that gunfighter moment, that high noon showdown. And by executing that in such an interesting way, and then giving you this campaign system that promises to give you these unique encounters of those gunfights, I mean, it's a really compelling package.
Yeah, like I guess we both came to the conclusion that we weren't all that thrilled about how it necessarily handled certain things, but the fantasy in which it delivers is very appealing. And I do know from, again, later editions of Boot Hill, that being second and third edition, that's brought out more. It becomes more of a role-playing game.
Yes.
In this stage, it feels at best a kind of proto-role-playing game. And to be fair, the time that this came out, those definitions hadn't been concretized.
Yes.
Like they haven't been made, oh, that's a role-playing game, and that's a war game, and this is an adventure game. These things are still very close to each other. So, yeah, that is the game. Troy, what do we got coming up for the next episode?
So next week, we are going back into RPGs in a very direct, literal way with the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition. So it looks like a war game from the outside if you read the labels, but when you get in there, it is a crunchy, serious role-playing game. And it's the start of Warhammer as a setting as we know it. So it'll be really fun to deep dive into, and we'll be sure to give you guys our preferred breakdown as we go through sort of a bit of the history, a bit of the game, a bit of the impact. And once you've heard it from us, I'm sure you'll be looking for it on drive-thru.
Absolutely. All right, then. We'll call that a show.